So I would go so far as to call self-awareness the meta skill of the 21st century. The meta skill of the 21st century. Why is that? Well, in addition to all the things we just talked about, an enhanced ability to partner with your clients, to connect with them, to support them, increasing your referrals, increasing your client retention. Empirically, self-awareness has been linked to happiness, life satisfaction, relationship strength, career satisfaction, confidence, communication skills, you name it. The reason I call it the meta skill is that it's underlying or foundational to all of the skills that are required to succeed in the 21st century. Again, things like emotional intelligence, influence, persuasion, sales, right? If you are not self-aware, if you do not understand who you are, how others see you, and the role you play in the world, you are going to come up short. Would you agree with that statement? Okay, so if I haven't convinced you, we're going to dig a little bit deeper. So this is all very well and good, isn't it? You should just be able to sort of go off on a mountaintop or sit in your office with the door closed and discover the 7 pillars of insight, right? Right? No? Well, what are we missing? Feedback. Let me give you an example. So about a year ago, I was deep into this self-awareness research program. And my husband and I, and about 6 of our friends, decided that we were going to go on a night on the town. And we went to the Vesta Dipping Grill, if you just want to picture it in your mind, my Colorado crowd. So we're having a great night. The check came. We didn't want to go home. And I should also tell you that I was driving my husband and I home that night, so I was not partaking in the copious amounts of alcohol that were being consumed. So everybody was thrilled. We actually went to a bar just a couple blocks away, and we all sat down and we pushed our high-top tables together. And my friend Teresa sat next to me, and I just adore her. And so we were talking, and I could tell everybody had been drinking. And she sort of dreamily looked at me and she said, "Tasha, I am so glad that Dave brought you into our lives 10 years ago when you first started dating." And I said, "Oh, Teresa, that's so nice." And before I could even say that, she said something that shook me to my very core. She said, and I quote, "Boy, have you come a long way since I first met you." So I said, "How very illuminating." And I asked a few questions, and I'll spare you the details, mostly for my pride. I learned that at age 26, when I first met my husband, I was insufferably arrogant. Insufferably arrogant. So we're driving home, and I'm sort of, in my head, and I decided that as a self-awareness researcher, I was going to need to explore this. So I said, "Dave, Teresa said something to me, and I wanted to kind of get your reaction." She basically said that when we first met, I was kind of full of myself. Dead silence next to me. Yeah, right, smart man. But as we'll learn, we should tell each other the truth. So I did appreciate what he said. So the first question he asked was, "Is this a trick question?" I said, no, it's not a trick question. And he said, "Well," and then he started to think of examples. He was regaling me with examples. One of them was when I arrived at the company that we both worked at, where we met, all of my peers had offices. And so I decided that I, too, was entitled to an office. And he said, "That was a little over the top." And I said, "Wow. To me, it was a quest for justice. But the impact I was having on the people around me, that was not what was being communicated." So again, I explored this. I went through this process of how could I think I know myself so well and have completely missed something so huge? But I also had Teresa's data that I had come a long way. So essentially, I did a lot of exploring. I learned that that is a part of me that sometimes comes out, that I've gotten a little bit better at tamping down, but that I now use as a barometer for a lot of my behavior. And that's what we all should do. When we get feedback that challenges us to our core, we have to look at it in the face. And I'll give you some ways to do that actually in a second. So the question I want you to all be asking in addition to sort of chuckling at all of the delusional people that might be in your world, is to ask yourself, if I were not as self-aware as I think I am, how would I know? How would I know? Pretty scary, isn't it? So about 3 years ago, I started studying the topic of self-awareness. And Barry mentioned that I'm primarily an organizational psychologist and executive coach. And what I noticed was the people who knew who they were and how other people saw them were always more successful. But I was pretty surprised to find that there was drips and drabs of research on this, but not as much as I would have imagined. But my research team came together. We analyzed over 700 studies. We surveyed thousands of people. And what we were trying to do was to isolate the code of self-awareness. How can we hack the code? And what we discovered was that we had to find people who started off maybe as low self-awareness people, even moderately self-aware, who were able to become highly self-aware. We couldn't study the people that had always been like that because usually they can't explain what they do. But the people who had made these dramatic improvements, we thought that was going to tell us what we needed to know. And as you'll see, it did. And there were a lot of surprises. But just to give a sort of a name for these people, one of my research assistants on a conference call really early on in this process referred to them sort of jokingly as self-awareness unicorns. And we kind of laughed, and obviously she said it because unicorns are mythical, they're special, and no one believes they exist, right? And the term stuck for that reason. These self-awareness unicorns, these people that against all odds were able to learn who they were and how they were seen. Now, do you think I could have just sent an email out to everyone I knew and said, hey, if you're extremely self-aware, come be a part of our study? People like Dennis Hawkins would have enthusiastically raised their hands. So we had a lot of checks and balances, the primary one being that someone who knew them well also had to rate them as highly self-aware. And so they and that other person had to agree they were self-aware, and they had to have demonstrated and seen a dramatic improvement. And what's really interesting, I think, about our unicorns is there were no patterns demographically. They came from all industries, all job types, all genders, all backgrounds, all countries, in fact. And among our unicorns was my financial advisor, Greg Shoei. And it was really fun, because I naturally used all the people I knew as my first round of subjects. And whenever the results came back, I said, yeah, that makes sense. And going back to what I was saying earlier, Greg is incredibly strong and incredibly effective at knowing how he's coming across and using that information to build strong and lasting relationships with his clients. I personally have enthusiastically, some might say overly enthusiastically, referred most of my friends to him for that reason. So no demographic similarities. The only similarities we found were really two things. Number one was a strong and profound belief that self-awareness was important. And number two was a strong and lifelong commitment to building it. Now, what's even scarier, and this is again empirically established, the least competent people are the most confident in their abilities. I'll say that again so you can process it. The least competent people are the most confident in their abilities. Let me give you an example of a study, and this was done with over 13,000 employees in a variety of fields, and I know there was a financial services sort of proportion. So they asked the employees, how are you performing in your job? And the employee responded, imagine a scale of 1 to 5. Then they asked their managers, how is this person performing? Their manager rated them. Shockingly and disturbingly, there was absolutely, on average, no relationship between these employees' self-ratings of their performance and their managers' ratings of their performance. And how often do we think about that? How do I see me? And how does my boss see me? How do my clients see me? And are those perceptions perhaps different? Now, I've sort of talked about some of the inner barriers, our personal barriers to self-awareness and truly seeing ourselves. There's also a wave sweeping our world. It's not just an age, a certain demographic. It's not just a certain country. There's actually evidence that this is essentially happening all over the world. And it's a cult. I call it the cult of self. In the cult of self, we are rewarded for being incredibly self-absorbed and yet totally unself-aware. All you need to do to realize this is look on your Facebook feed. Here's some data, again, to back this up. Just how bad is this? These are all studies. Selfie takers tend to have shallower relationships than people who don't take selfies. Social media causally increases narcissism. This is not just a correlation for the geeks in the room. This is a causal connection. And then finally, texters, on average, tend to be less personally reflective. Now again, these societal factors may or may not be influencing you equally. They might not be influencing you particularly strongly, but they are there for all of us. And that is another barrier to self-awareness. So the first way to break this down is something that I call the 7 pillars of insight. And I'll go through them quickly, and then I'll circle back with an example of another person from your field. So our values are the principles that we want to live our lives by. Our passions are the things that we love to do. Our aspirations are the things that we want to not just accomplish, but to experience in our lives. Fit means, do I know the type of environment that will help me be engaged, happy, and successful? Our patterns, this is the best way to think about this is kind of personality. What are my consistent ways of behaving over time and in multiple situations? Our reactions are sort of the ability to monitor our moment-by-moment interaction with the world. And a lot of times our reactions are reflective of our strengths and our weaknesses. And then finally, and this is the most obvious one to the people around us, the impact we have on others. So again, everybody thinks at some point about how other people see them. The problem, however, is that we usually assume that unless I'm doing something especially egregious, I'm good. Surely people would tell me. We already know that that's not true. So what our unicorns do, first of all, it's not any easier for them to get feedback than it is for the rest of us, mere mortals. But what distinguishes them is that they do it anyway. They do it anyway because the value of self-awareness to them is very clear. FDR said, courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the assessment that something else is more important than fear. And in our case, that something is insight, external self-awareness. So we're actually going to skip this. All right, so let me give you this tool now, the right feedback tool. This will help you push past both of those obstacles that we saw. And I'll tell it to you, or I'll teach it to you through a story of a client that I worked with. So when I first met Kim, she works in the professional services area. She had just gotten a 360. How many of you have gotten a 360? How many of you have no idea what I'm talking about? Okay, oh good. This is going to be a huge thing. So a 360 is essentially an assessment that tells you how you see you versus how the people you work with see you. And I'll give you some resources at the end of this that you can actually get a couple of free ones. But Kim had learned that, completely unbeknownst to her, her coworkers saw her as acerbic, aggressive, and sort of over the top, particularly in meetings. And it was harming her relationships. And her clients were seeing it too. So Kim and I wrestled with this, and I honestly felt for her because this happens so often. we don't take the time to get this feedback, and then it smacks us in the face. Sometimes it's too late, and sometimes we never hear it at all. But Kim had an opportunity. So here's the tool. It's actually pretty simple. The right feedback is involving 3 pieces, okay? Number 1 is you have to ask the right people. As we learned with Eleanor and Phil, not everyone will tell us the truth. Before I talk about who we should ask for feedback from, I'll tell you 2 groups we should not. The first are unloving critics. Unloving critics hate everything we do. Might be a coworker with an agenda, an overly perfectionist boss, right? So unloving critics. Then there are uncritical lovers, the people that just love everything we do, no matter what it is, i.e. our moms, a boss who thinks we walk on water, or who's too afraid to tell the truth. So neither of those are what you want. What you want are loving critics. And I know this is not an incredibly profound statement, but I'm surprised at how rarely people actually think about this. These should be people who you know have your best interests at heart, unequivocally, but who you also know are going to tell you the truth. Sometimes closeness is not a good indicator of trust. That's why they invented the word frenemy. So be careful. Make sure you're picking the people that really have your best interest at heart. So Kim picked 2 peers and me, which was smart because I was being paid to tell her the truth. So the next thing we looked at was the right questions. And specifically here, what you want to do is be very, very clear about what feedback you want. And even more specifically, what are the specific behaviors that you need to know about? For example, if you asked your client, how am I doing? They would say, well, what does he want to hear? That he's a snappy dresser, not very good at people skills, or a really great financial advisor? They wouldn't know, and so then it's awkward, and you don't get the feedback you need. So for Kim, the question was very simple. It was a hypothesis. I am aggressive and acerbic in meetings. And part of what she wanted to do was get more feedback about how she was coming across, because she really didn't understand the feedback at all. So that was the specific question that she asked. Finally, we had to come up with the right process. You can't blindside people and just go and say, can you give me some feedback on how I did in these meetings? So Kim actually approached, obviously me, was kind of easy, but her 2 peers, and gave them the context. I got some 360 feedback. I'm kind of throwing up my arms. I don't know what it means. It's specific to meetings. Since you're going to be in meetings with me over the next 3 months, I'm wondering if you can take some notes about how I'm showing up and help me figure this out. And as much as she wanted to ask them to say yes on the spot, she gave them time to think about it. Naturally, all of them agreed. So Kim learned so many things through this process. She had a phone call with each of her loving critics every month for 3 months. And the small amount of time she invested paid off. She started to understand exactly what she was doing. And by understanding what she was doing, she was able to start changing it. And this didn't happen overnight, but within about 6 months from that, she had completely transformed her relationships, not just with her clients, but with her boss. Now, what I didn't tell you earlier was her boss had been getting complaints about Kim and her behavior in meetings for literally years. The complaints stopped. And in fact, I recently talked to him, and it's been a couple years now, and he said that Kim is now his most valuable team member. The right people, the right questions, the right process.